Okay, let's show a few ways that we can actually start to clean up the code a little bit. And the first way we're going to do a little bit of cleanup is by standardizing the response that we give back to the client. So you'll notice that in each of these API calls that we have, we are repeating a little bit of code. We're typically writing or setting a header to application type JSON. We're setting the HTTP code to 200. We're returning some kind of JSON string depending on what kind of data we get back, etc. So by convention, one of the things that I like to do when I'm building my APIs is for each API call to have the exact same response. And I'm going to use two items in the response that comes back. One is a status, which will either be success or failure, and the other component will be data, which can be anything. It can have an array of user information, it can contain a message, or whatever we want. So in order to actually implement this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define 3 new functions. The main function will be a function that's just responsible for responding to an API request. And it's going to take a bunch of arguments, but I'll explain them in a little bit more detail as we're writing the actual code. So it's going to take a response object so that we can actually send a response to the client. It's going to take our next argument, similar to how our API calls did as well. And it's also going to take a couple new arguments. A status, which will either be success or failure. Data, which can be anything, an array or a message. And finally, an HTTP code. So 200 would be success, 404 could be not found, etc. And we're going to say that every response is going to follow the same syntax. It's going to have a status component, whatever was passed into us as the status, and it's going to have a data component, whatever data was passed into the function as well. So once we've built our response, in order to actually send it, we are going to assume that we're always going to be using the JSON response format for this particular API. So content type is always going to be JSON. I can copy and paste this line to say that the HTTP status code will be whatever this function happens to get passed. And last but not least, we need a couple more lines. This line is going to convert the response to a JSON format. And finally, we are just going to return next. So this is going to be our basic response, but I'm going to simplify it a bit further and say that let's define a couple more functions. One we can call success, and I'll create another function called failure. Because successful and failure type responses are going to have certain things in common as well. So if an API call was successful, we can say respond, and we're going to pass in res and next, which we also will accept as arguments. And for a successful response, we know that the status is always going to be success. The data is going to be whatever we were passed in. And the HTTP status code is going to be 200. So for a successful response, we only have to give it this res and next information, as well as whatever data we want to return, and it'll automatically put in status success and status code 200. Similarly, for the failure function, we're going to have res next data as well as this extra HTTP code argument. And like before, we're going to call respond, except the status is always going to be failure. The data is whatever came in, and the HTTP code is going to be whatever we were passed. And the reason we do the HTTP code this way is so that each type of failure, whether it's a not found or whether it's a bad information passed into our API, can have its own unique status code per type of error. So to see how this will work, what we can now do is we can start modifying each of our API calls to make use of these new functions. So for example, this GET request, we can delete all 4 of these lines and just say success. Pass it the res, pass it the next, and we are going to pass the entire user array as our data. Similarly, for the rest of these API calls, we can literally delete the same 4 lines that were being repeated each time. And this one would be success, response object, next, and the users at parse int rec.params.id. And then similarly over here, we can take this user object that was coming back, and we'll just say get rid of these lines and return the individual user with a successful response. Over here, we can again just return the individual user as our successful response. In our delete API call, which returns just a true response, what we can do is get rid of all of these lines. And then what we're actually going to do here is just pass, since there's no data that we really need to return, we'll pass an empty array in the data part because the status is already going to be success. So if I try running these API calls, ideally we are going to get the exact same responses that we got before. So nothing should change from that perspective. So let's create a few new users. So I created a few, I created 4, and as you can see, we have a status component and a data component. And the status is now going to be success or failure in every API call, and the data will contain the relevant information. So I've created a few users. Let's do get for user 3. Again, you see that we get status success and that user's information. Let's modify user 3, and let's just add some 3s everywhere. And you can see that we get status success. The same 2 components to our response come back in every API call, which makes our API a bit more predictable to someone that might be using it. And last but not least, I'll just issue a quick delete. I'll delete user 3. We don't need any body component, but it doesn't hurt to pass it. So we delete and we get success, and there's no additional data. Check all of our users. Whoops, we need the get method. And we'll see that user 3 is missing. And as you can see, it just looks a lot cleaner to have a standardized response format. Okay, that's it for cleanup part 1, and I'll see you in the next lesson, which is cleanup part 2.